Okay, we're going to study the Irish origins of civilization. Volume 1, Chapter 10, The Disciples of Horus. This is not meant to be a critique of the site necessarily, but we're going to go through this and I'm going to do some additions that I think, and perhaps a little subtraction and so on, and a little clarification of the way that I see things in a little bit different light than this. But we'll also see a lot of first archaeologists and things that have been said in the Wayback Machine and even closer times. Let's just get into this here. He says, the land that we now call Egypt was colonized and was originally peopled by fair Celts from the shores of Britain. This was the exodus of the Aryans, some of which returned later to their primeval homes. This was written by Combs Beaumont in Riddle of the Prehistoric Britain. I would say a statement like that just won't fly because you're saying Britain, and really that was before Bridget and the things that ended up making up Britain today. And we know about the Proto-Indo-Europeans that we've talked about a lot, but that ended up being cousins of each other and really the same stock, if you will, and the mingling of which. That's why there's so much unity. But regardless, I would say, the shores of Britain. You could say the UK, but the UK, also is the United Kingdom, and that's something also that's there. So would you say the northwestern shore of Europe? Well, Europa was named after a Phoenician princess, so you could say that, but we're going way back before that, aren't we? So it comes across as a little different, but then whenever you use terms like that, when people call Anatolia Turkey, and they want to, the Turkish people didn't live there, they were all the way over, there's a whole lot to this, so usually we just say something like ancient Anatolia, and people should know what we're talking about. Blue-eyed Caucasian, Caucasus Mountains are right there. Noah and all that stuff. Classical archaeologists are in agreement that the ancient migrations did take place in prehistoric times, although they often tend to be rather hazy about the dates and the countries involved. That's by Ralph Ellis. He's a good researcher, and he said so in a book called Jesus, the Last of the Pharaohs. He's made a few books about that. I really am not familiar with all of them and what they entail. I saw one of his things on the Shroud of Turin, and that coincided with a lot of stuff that I had done about Jesus and King Isis of Edessa and so on, of Edessa. And so that made a lot of connections, but I haven't gone further into these last books that he came out of in the last pharaohs. Although whenever we've, all of these little things that I'm showing you keep adding up into this web, and every little video adds up and shows you a piece, and hopefully I make connections. In a lot of videos I try to make enough connections to where it validates it pretty much. I mean, I used to go around messing with pieces of pottery and trying to make comparisons. And what if they just didn't put the dents over the dot? Some of you know what I'm talking about. Or what if they didn't put the cord thing on there this time with the corded wear? What if they didn't put the dots above the rim? What if they just suddenly decided to do them like this? Genetics helps us find the answers to whether or not that was people that changed, or things and groupings, or they got some of their pottery once and they started mocking it, but they did it in a different way and didn't put the lines above the dots, and who's who. or we seem to be a species with amnesia, but it seems whenever I'm researching back at people that were talking in elder times, they weren't confused near as much as we are now. And there's probably a pretty good reason for that, but we don't want to get into that necessarily either in this video. We learn from official sources that the symbols found throughout Western countries on the flags and state regalia, etc., come from spurious migrating Semitic tribes. We are told that the symbolism originates with these tribes and goes back to the dawn of time. I did a couple of different videos talking about the 10 tribes and their dispersal and who was kind of who back in, and Gog and Magog and everything, in Japheth and Iapetus, and how that works with Jupiter and so on, and these people that were gods of the earth at one time. And still really pretty much are. But if you look back at these ancient people, there was a time whenever they broke from that tradition and went to a normalcy that we kind of had today, and there was a shift. You saw it first really in Sumerians. If you look into it at all, the Sumerians went into an ideal that, well, Gilgamesh was only part divine, or what we would call a demigod, something that people would probably look at and say that, oh, that's a Nephilim with the angels and all this type of crap. Yeah, well, it could equate to that too, but he was part divine. Well, Alexander Great he had heterochromy with eyes to where one was blue and one was brown. And so because of his one blue eye, they said that he was half divine. There was things that went along with blue eyes that go with divinity. You can look up blue-eyed gods just in some Google image thing and things, and it might surprise you that people that don't normally have blue eyes themselves have their ancient gods with blue eyes. And we've shown this from the Orient and even into South America and back in the Wayback Machine for them. But the supposed Semitic tribes works out a whole lot different. When we look at that and where that comes from, and what people would call Jews is something that's totally different, and where that actually originates from, it doesn't have attachment to the people that you know of today. And really, Ashkenaz was the son of Gomer, which was again Japhethite. But it does say that they will dwell in the house of each other and so on. What does that really mean? Well, let's look at it from a different way. That J didn't exist. And so whenever we look at things like that, what we're really looking at as a word that used to be spelled in a different way, like Dios. And we still know it, and that's one of the reasons Latin has been a changed language too, because it's somewhat revealing. But Dios, Dios Pater, the Day Father, is what that means, and that's the Proto-Indo-European God in the sky thing that we all have in our Bible still to this day. That's the same thing. We've got a whole thing that ran down through, and he had a son. Yeah, but he's still the same guy and all that stuff, right? How does that work out? Well, it's quite complicated, actually. And in the reality of it all versus the way we kind of feel about it, too. Got a lot of videos about that. Let's just see if I can get through this here. We also know what dawn of time means officially to most people. We know it refers to the period between 7,000 and 11,000 years BC. However, as we're now beginning to realize, these dates do not mark the beginnings of mankind's cultural and technological history. Yeah, and this was written a few years back, but I'm not sure if they would have known about Göbekli Tepe and so on at this time. I find that there was a lot of people that didn't know about it until it started really getting whipped up at the end there. But we always end up with that 11,000 years. It's odd, whenever I first started studying this whenever I was a kid, most of the literature and things tried to say, oh, it's a 3500 BC. I mean, 3800. I mean, 5200. I mean, about 6500. As the 7. Oh, the last ice age ended, and so it's after that, 6500. Hold on, you had it at 7 or 8 here earlier. What? Well, Göbekli Tepe dates to that time of 12,000. And so we end up finding a people that have a technological advance with astronomy and being able to put up pillars and things that are lined up to alignments and astrology that goes on. And if there's anything that we probably didn't have in our mental picture as far as caveman and what the hell he was doing, the one thing that we probably would never put in there is that he was tracking the stars. But amazingly, we were told that they were kind of real primitive back at this point here, but you look at it and that's not the case at all. In fact, hopefully I've been able to show you in a lot of my other videos, especially with things like sacred geometry and stuff, whenever they said people just kind of popped out of popcorn and they knew all this stuff kind of out of nowhere, it didn't really work that way. Pardon me. We put it in a little timeline and go through it, and we keep finding these epochs that it goes through, whatever. A lot of intelligence gets passed into a next level to a next level, and adding two things together ends up making a third that's even more, and so on. Like Egypt was great, but when the Hyksos brought them all their extra weapons, different types of metallurgy, the chariot and the wheel and the horse itself, well, that was a big game changer, and it sure helped them persist. But that dating is getting whacked like to hell. In fact, we've got it pretty much to 22,000 BC, where people had some stuff going on. Looks pretty damn good. And then even cave paintings are real tellable. We're actually showed in a recent video just earlier this year where the speaker says the phrase that I've said before, but it's always great to hear it from somebody else that's a scientist, and tells you that Lagoon cave painting where it has all of the animals drawn across the sky, and they know this is Taurus and it's got the dots on it, and there's the Pleiades and things that goes along with it. If that wall was transparent and nighttime came along and it whipped across the sky, right there it lines up with it. It would actually, we're no telling how they crawled down through the cave and got to this point and knew how to, through that wall depicted, and it's on that wall, which has that facade that goes around onto it. Pretty incredible. Some people had an artistic flair that others don't have, and you can actually see the differential between some people drawing stuff that really look like cartoons to the point that people draw something a little better. You look at a lot of the Egyptian things, and nowadays you'd say, well, that looks like a cartoon, and somebody probably in junior high school could draw something like that, and so on. And yes, well, by the age of the scribes, they should all do that, but they were all trying to draw the same thing and not have their different little flair and ooh and try to look like this. And anyhow, Herodotus himself is on record as having been told by the contemporary Egyptian priests that their written records went back no less than 12,000 years. Eusebius, the early Christian bishop of Alexandria, calculated Manetho's recorded history as taking Egypt's civilization back to 35,525 years. Other records, both cultural and historical, were far more ancient still. This is by John Gordon in Egypt, Child of Atlantis. And so here we have a tale of Atlantis. The Egyptians also were the ones that first supposedly told the tale of Atlantis, and that got passed down through. Of these people that used to live on these islands. In fact, there's a reference to that here in a little bit. Hang in there. First of all, because you see a depiction down in the corner, I have to clarify that Horus a lot of times is drawn pale, but here he's drawn dark. There's a reason they show dark depictions and non-dark depictions. And it's not necessarily just a suntan. Whenever they're in action, that would indicate that they're out in the sun a lot, and so they would have this depiction for them. You'll find that the women are drawn pale, priests are drawn pale. You would think the king would be drawn pale, but that don't work out. See, he's in action. He's doing something. It's not unique at all. You can find it in Greek art of the time, the same thing. Etruscan art of the time, same thing. You can easily find it. You just look it up, Etruscan art. Are there vases? Are there things? It'll all show it. The Mitanni art, there's so many people. The Minoans, had the same depiction of red ochre males and pale women. Because at a time, as I've described before, they were able to keep the women pale, because they had figured out all these things, and a woman is more the mother of things and does this thing, and she's kept sacred and holy, and you don't want her, and so it became a thing. Well, it almost became too much of a thing with an idea of like rickets and stuff, so they have to get some sunlight, but it isn't too difficult in a place like the ancient Middle East, Near East, or say Egypt, is it? Horus, from Har or Hari, Hor or Heru, was a god of the sun, primarily associated with southern Egypt and ancient city of Heracleopolis, which is city of the hawk or hawks. In early dynastic era, he was referred to as the distant one. And so he was a god that was like untouchable, unseeable. You can't look into his eyes. In fact, one eye was the moon and the other was the sun. He was the all-seeing eye, electric eye in the sky watching you. But he is the reason we use the word hours for the day. For already they had 12 declamations of time, which hooked up with the Sumerian declamations of time and Chronos and all the things that go with it. And we end up having 12 hours of the day. All you got to do is move a letter there, and it easily comes out to being. Horus, having the US on the end of it, is like a Greek appellation where they put us on the end of most everything, like Perseus or Cronus, or it can go on and on and on. The distant one. The letter H was used as the, or a title, as in horizon, meaning prayer, becoming what we say is horizon. This has to do with Horus. And so does the idea of the sun setting. That word is from set. He's protecting the boat. He's the only one who knew how to overtake a pep. Well, he's the god of chaos and typhon and everything else. Yeah, but he works in conjunction. It's all one unity. Therefore, though, Hari would really have been the Ari. Horus was he of the Ari. The root Ari can be found in the word aristocracy, referring to a noble, enlightened elite. The term is misused today with some of those who have no right to it. Aristocracy becomes from Aryan. Used to not be a thing that was bad to talk about until the World War II thing, and then all of a sudden now that's got to be a bad word, and we always say Proto-Indo-Europeans, but that's a little bit different of a moniker, as I've shown. And it's not just these one people, no. Oh, it's these one guys that went over to India, and no, we'll talk about that here in a second too. But you'll find it in the words like arithmetic. I think we'll talk about that shortly, where we talk about mathematics a little bit and things. And these people had this fine mathematics already going on, this advanced, this higher mathematics, arithmetic. The Sumerians had a math that was just figured out a few years ago. I've done a video on it. I'd like for you to look it up if you question this fact at all. They had not only sacred geometry, which we're talking about, which entails higher math to the nth degree and huge radical numbers like 432,000 or 4,320,000. It just goes on and on. Figuring out the great year. But they also had a form of trigonometry that was based on the number 6 that people finally figured out. A lot of these tablets here, they've got all these calculations and these lines drawn at these angles and stuff, and it looks like they're trying to do geometry or something, but it's just, and those were all just in a bucket, boxes full of them and stuff that they found that they were like, oh, it's just like they're keeping track of how much grain they got or something. They find out, no, they're going with the trajectories of the planets and da-da-da, and they got it figured out, and their math is precise as hell, and it's easy to do once you use their formula based on 6, which is hexadecimal, which, believe it or not, is what computers work on whenever it transposes. So no matter what you do, it goes to the computer in that logistics form, but that's another point. E.A. Wallace Budge is a famous, one of the earliest archaeologists, and is well known for what he brought into archaeology. He's as famous as Flinders Petrie and some of the others that were the starting of people that started really looking back at history and starting to capitulate the things that we put into museums that we have today. And it's kind of the reason we have museums is because of people like this. Sure, we know, we look back, some of it looked more like grave robbing than anything and some kind of Indiana Jones thing, but it really spurned out what we have today, and the keeping of it and the advanced archaeology we have today grows from it. From his book, it says one of the titles of Horus was Horus of the Blue Eyes. What? Yeah, well, the Wajet eye that we know is the eye of Horus. It's always a blue eye, so there's a reason for that. Nekhen, which is Hyrcanopolis, was a religious and political capital of Upper Egypt at the end of the pre-dynastic period and probably also during the early dynastic period, so ushering it in. It was the center of the cult of the hawk god Horus of Nekhen, which was raised in this city in one of the most ancient temples in Egypt, and it retained its importance as the cult center of the divine patron of the kings long after it had been otherwise declined. So, whenever Egypt formed, because it was a large component of one of the major city-states there, and the thing that they had going on, because each one kind of had their own little god deal going on, whenever it came into power, and the ones that came into power had this, and because people kept looking back, was that when we got it together? So that was the cool thing, right? So they kept harking on this, and it tried to falter a few times, but he never came more than a second fiddle to anybody. Let's continue. The original settlement on the site dates from the Naqada I or the late Badarian period. At its height from about 3400 BC, it had at least 5,000 and possibly as many as 10,000 inhabitants. That's just in that one city. I have a lot of other ones, but this would be one of the major ones. The ruins of the city were originally excavated towards the end of the 19th century by English archaeologist James E. Quibell and F.W. Green in the principal deposit of the Temple of Nekhen. They found important ceremonial proto-dynastic artifacts such as the Narmer palette and the famous mace head bearing the name of King Scorpion. You can find that in Wikipedia online, but they also found these gold-plated wooden statues with inlaid blue eyes. And the blue eye was like a lapis lazuli, which only comes from like Afghanistan. So there was this play that was in there, but also it had holes drilled through it, much like you'd put on the necklaces, and they'd use these to make them look like blue eyes and encrust them into a gold foil statue by then. And it was thin foil, not as thin as tin foil is today or stuff, but it's a thin foil too. You can see these things online. There's pictures of them. Look up blue-eyed Egyptians and keep going down through there, and you'll see these little gold tinfoil guys with blue eyes, and you'll be like, what? Yeah, that's them. Yeah. The earliest pre-dynastic, proto-dynastic person that we have that was naturally mummified and stuff is Ginger. He's a blonde-haired guy. So, not too much questions about it ever until a modern time. People start saying certain things and leading people to believe other things. But although equally magnificent temples and megaliths exist in Ireland and Scandinavia, North America, and Mexico, all the entire lost cities are found beneath the oceans. And though the vast majority of words, place, and personal names in the Bible are of Irish origin, we rather live with mysterious and unsolvable conundrums that face the truth. In most every case where there's a major site exists, or where a great civilization existed, we find the same refrain from the modern inhabitants. Either we are told that godlike strangers erected the sites, or that technically superior semi-divine ancestors like Dagon coming up out of the sea and things, of whom we are now suspiciously find no trace. They did it. Oh, just the gods did it. They did it. Archaeologists refuse to explain who did these mysterious ancestors and who they were. Strangely, that makes me think of Lalibela, where people try to say all kinds of things about it now, but in growing up and even on In Search Of, where it had Leonard Nimoy talking about it, they have the people and the elders there talking about that these white angels came down and they built the whole thing at night. Real quick, too. And they put all their symbols in all the windows, and you go and look in the windows, and there's swastikas and Jewish crosses. And you're like, what? Yeah, but there's more to it. And then he reaches over, and he's talking about how they looked and everything, and he goes over and he grabs one of the camera guys. Says, this guy. The world over, legends affirm that the indigenous forebears were not the builders, astronomers, and healers. Investigators habitually look to every country except Ireland for their answers. It's almost comical to say that we can be certain that Ireland played a seminal role merely because the laws of exclusion are in its favor. All other countries have been studied and can be struck off the originators of civilizations. So dare we now, at long last, face the truth that has lain in plain sight for so long? Dare we examine the evidence for the Irish origins of civilizations and have done with the damnable conundrums? Well, we're going to look into that, but I would say that this may be old enough written to where he doesn't know other things, and I've made other connections. I myself am Irish, and would love nothing more than that to come out to be the truth of reality, but I find that the ancient Irish didn't really almost exist. Their continental ice shelf was down on top of it, and everybody was moved over and down and south quite a bit, and who you would call the Irish are somebody a little bit else, and that makes the same sense and the same idea. So whenever you point it out and you try to say that in a pinpoint, it doesn't quite come out as true. In fact, you say people haven't looked into it at all. People have kind of a little, and they sloughed it off because what kind of proof do you have? Well, oddly enough, we have a stone circle that's called Stonehenge. It's right over here. And we've got one that looks just like it, but it's made all primitive like, called Dudoel, and it's right there in Egypt. And it's lined up to the same things. and the same seasons and the same calendar spots. And there's other places that no one is willing to even deny that those aren't all those Proto-Indo-European people. Yeah. Some of them are on certain parallels, and even the size of the circle dictated that they knew where they were on the ball of the earth. And this old bullshit about they thought the earth was flat actually kind of comes from people misinterpreting the Bible, or the people that wrote the Bible misinterpreting ancient people and what they had said. For it works out a little differently. I've got other videos about that, and if I start going off on it now, this is going to become a four-parter on me just trying to do this one. So let's just continue. The ancient Egyptians were fully aware of the 25,920-year cycle of the precession of the equinox, the precession. If you haven't seen it, I beckon you to look at my sacred geometry videos where it talks constantly about that and the measurements of time that are in that. So you have time and space, measurement that are all done on the same thing, and it's all based on our bodies and the proportions that are built into man, and where the mile comes from, and how with using that mile that's hooked up off the man, which it says is of the angel, hooks up to exactly this distance, that sacred number ends up being the distance to the sun, the diameter of the moon, all of these other figures that work out. Yeah, people have said sacred geometry, that's that thing where it's like a seashell, right? And it's like, well, yeah, that's Fibonacci sequences or whatever you're looking at there. That's why it goes a whole lot deeper than that. It might be a primer to help get you started, but just like it swirls and goes woo way down in there, it gets deep. If you've been watching my videos, it gets quite deep. I guarantee you, if you watch it again, even though I try to explain it pretty good, you'll catch something that you never did before. You'll be like, oh. The idea, however, that a nomadic group of hunter-gatherers about 5,000, 6,000 years ago should suddenly, within the space of a few hundred years, or even 1,000 perhaps, from merely watching the night sky but without using any instrumentation, be able to quickly develop the requisite mathematical and scientific knowledge to verify such a hypothesis is patently ludicrous. John Gordon wrote this on Egypt, child of Atlantis. We're going to quote that about 3 times in here, I think, total, but there are other people and elder writers who have turned around and figured this out. Once they figured out and hooked up all the sacred geometry and all the numbers, they were like, you've got to be shitting me if you're trying to get me to believe that these people were like just starting out to be hunter-gatherers, and hey, what if we put them in rows? Wouldn't that be nice? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they're like, well, at nighttime I kind of sit around looking at the stars and boing. No, that's not how that's going to work. Once somebody got a kick, you could get it off of that and go and go and go and go, but it would have to do with something, and it can't be from that age. And again, you see him talking about 5,000 years ago. What we know now, that was going on in Catalhoyuk, and we know now in the River Boyne, in New Grange, it was going on there too, and its connections. And I made a Christmas video, a little special, because I found it right coming into that, and I was like, this would be a good one to put out. And the sacred cow and the unblemished cow, and how that all works with Christianity and what Egypt had going on. And in fact, that's why they call it the Milky Way. It's all still there. A lot of this is still right there in your face all the time, and you don't even notice it. You have no idea. Whenever I was a kid, rock and roll album covers and things were full of this information and stuff, and I talk about how all of a sudden when I was reading up all these things and I made all these connections, it just blew my mind. And then when I was looking around the room trying to think about it, everything else was there in my face again, and I was like, oh my God, what the hell? Whoa! And it's just overwhelming. Perhaps that's why they introduce people into these mysteries a little bit slower and get a certain point and let you digest so you don't freak out and go, hold on, you lost me way back at what the hell are you talking about? That last statement was extremely important, though, in figuring that out. It could be used against saying the Sumerians. It could be used against everything. In fact, nowadays, it's extremely important to say that exact statement can be used against the people of Göbekli Tepe. So how far can we go back? And what are we talking about, 35,000 years? Well, Cro-Magnon man, about that time's DNA is still here today. They had a capability. They just had to get the things together to make it go. A lot of people believe they had to make it go again because everything got destroyed right about that 12,000 years ago, Younger Dryas. I believe he mentions it a few times. Where are we at? Yeah, I better get going here on it, huh? One of the most important finds within the land of Egypt occurred when Egyptologist and archaeologist Professor Walter B. Emery in 1903 to 1971 was excavating tombs at the necropolis of Saqqara, one of the oldest cities in the land. Professor Emery discovered the remains of men with blonde hair and fair complexions. These individuals were revered by the Egyptians as the gifted elite. Vittore de Gesar and Adriano Forgione wrote about Emery's enigmatic discoveries in their article Malta, Skulls of the Mother Goddess. The famous Egyptologist, author Archaic Egypt, discovered the remains of individuals who lived in the pre-dynastic epoch. These presented dilocephalous skull larger than that of the local ethnic group, fair hair and taller, heavier build. Emery declared that this stock wasn't indigenous to Egypt but had performed an important sacerdotal and governmental role in the country. They were the ruling elite. This race kept its distance from the common people, blending only with the aristocratic, there's that airy again, aristocratic classes, and the scholar associated them with the Shemsu Hor, the disciples of Horus, which I've talked about and made a video about last year, and this should make a connection right here that I talked all around. Until approximately 3000 BC, being mentioned in the Turin Papyrus and the list of kings at Abydos. It's what it says. For 10,000 years, the Shemsu Hor did all this shit and put it all together for us. A lot of people say, well, look, the artifacts from there don't quite go back that far and everything. No, the Shemsu Hor are talking about what they've been doing. And here we are. This is that Atlantis idea. Again, some things are not looked at in the right light, I guess, and sometimes you just got to turn around and go, well, look at it from over here. Professor Emery wrote of the finds of his archaic Egypt culture and civilization in Egypt 5,000 years ago. Towards the end of the 4th millennium BC, 4000 BC, the people known as the disciples of Horus appear as a highly dominant aristocracy that governed entire Egypt. The theory of the existence of this race is supported by the discovery of the pre-dynastic tombs in the northern part of Higher Egypt, of the anatomical remains of individuals with bigger skulls and builds than the native population, which is so much difference to include any hypothetical common racial strain. The less fusion of the two races must have come about in ages that occurred, more or less, with the unification of two Egyptian kingdoms. The racial origin of these invaders is not known, and the route they took in their penetration of Egypt is equally obscure. What we're looking at here is what we used to talk about, the giants of the Cro-Magnons, and then that and the other, these people that were breaking 6 foot in a time when people coming out of the Younger Dryas events and stuff had been knocked down, like insular dwarfism, and a lot of them, due to that and droughts and things they had gone through, had broken down to 5.5 foot tall or less, and you have somebody breaking 6 foot tall easy. And of course they've always written this off to, well, the elite got to eat real good. It doesn't work that way, really. It doesn't work to where you just eat that good and all of a sudden, bingo, certain things that have to happen to trigger you to become a lot larger and things. People don't realize that a lot of us come from hybridization and so on, and this hybridization that brought about Cro-Magnon that seemed to pop up out of like popcorn out of nowhere, having his extra tools, seems to be that missing event. And we don't call them Cro-Magnon anymore. We call them early European modern humans because they still exist today. We find that the dawn of historic period of Egypt was divided into two rival kingdoms of the north and south, both Caucasians, and both ruled by a royal house and aristocracy of the same race, and both known traditionally as the followers of Horus, the demigods of Manetho's history, back whenever it was just the gods. You see, so again, we talk about when there were gods and whenever gods ruled the earth. Well, the Caesars made themselves into God, and that's what the Bible ended up being about and trying to take Titus to the next level, by the way. But Egyptians were gods on this earth, and da-da-da. We don't have that kind of crap today. Yeah, we do. The Pope is put in that position. Make no bones about it. The Pope is put in that exact position as the go-between, the big G's. It's there. It works the same way. And again, we had the Sumerians that say that they had all the gods that go back down there through it. Well, if we look at their kings list that comes out, the conspicuous thing is if you add up that entire kings list, it's got a bunch of weird long-ass numbers. And everybody says, oh, they used to live for a long time before then because, why? Well, add up all those numbers and you come up with, oh, what's that number? 432,000 years. What the hell? Yeah, there's that number again that works with the sun and everything else on sacred geometry. Yeah, so even in their first Kings list they wrote down, they encoded it into there. Yeah, there's just like there's a bunch of them in the Bible that are encoded in, and 144,000 that'll be saved, and all these type of things that are put in as symbolism that a lot of people don't even catch the real meaning of. According to the ancient so-called building text found at the temple of Edfu in Egypt, the Shemsu Hor, disciples of Horus, were a race of highly endowed sages who dwelt on 10 pre-diluvian islands. Of their elders was Thoth, known as the Greeks as Hermes and Romans as Mercury. And now we're talking about an idea that works with the Phoenicians' idea of Taurus and so many others, and Ningishita of the Sumerians. And this is this one god entity that was smarter than others. Even all the gods knew this dude was smart. Anytime they asked something, he was the nerd. But what did he bring? Well, he brought writing and all these things instead of, oh, that's fantastic. No, wait, hold on. In the Bible it says the evil angels did that, didn't they? So how does that work out? Make that connection. Oh, maybe everything, hold on. What? Let's move along here. In fact, if this goes on to a part 2, which it's fixing to in about a minute and a half here, it's going to be in your top left-hand corner, and we'll continue with this on number 10 here that we're on. It'll be part 2, and again, it'll be your top left-hand corner when we get there. Great were my people, he says, in the ancient days, great beyond the conception of the little people that are now around me, knowing the wisdom of old, seeking far within the heart of infinity knowledge that belonged to earth's youth. Wise were we with the wisdom of the children of light who dwelt among us. Strong were we with the power drawn from the eternal fire, and all of these greatest among the children of men was my father, Thoth, keeper of the great temple, link between the children of light who dwelled within the temple and the races of men who inhabited the 10 islands. That gives you that moment too, doesn't it? We're going to go to part 2 now. It's in your top left-hand corner. We'll see you whenever you get there. Hey, like, share, and subscribe before you go, if you aren't already. Peace.